we are all here because we believe that housing is a human right, and that human right sometimes is denied to many in our community because of discrimination. As we all know, housing is connected to many different things in our lives. When we think about buying a home or where we are going to live, what are the factors that we take into consideration? Feel free to put in the chat. What are some of the things that you think about when you're looking for a home and thinking about where you want to live?
Are you looking at the chat board?
I'm not. Can you tell me?
Okay. So we have affordability, convenience, friendly neighbors, location, schools, public transportation, recreational activities, and close by employment.
Yeah, wonderful. Excellent. Yeah, housing is connected to all of those things. Where we work and how far we are from our jobs and what jobs are available. Transportation, whether public transportation is available, what kind of vehicles we need to drive in the particular location. Recreation, if we're interested in living in a more isolated area with hiking and kayaking available versus parks and other indoor recreational activities. We think about safety and security. What is the crime rate? And do we feel safe here? And are these neighbors who would be looking out for us? And school is deeply connected to schools and choice. In Vermont, we have some choice towns. This is really important if you have kids in schools, because if your children aren't getting their needs met, or you don't like a particular school, or they're being bullied or harassed at school, if you live in a choice town, you have other schools available to you, and that's really important. Community, not just physical proximity to other individuals, but also will you feel welcomed, and will you feel a sense of belonging in that particular community? And what are the signs of that? And are these things that we have to think about because of our privileges? Or if we don't have those privileges, are these things that weigh more heavy in our consideration when we're looking at homes and where we want to live? And healthcare as well. We know that housing is connected to accessibility to healthcare and choice in regards to doctors and dentists and pediatricians and so forth. One thing I actually forgot here is voting. Also, in Vermont, I would say that it is generally easy to vote. In other states, it can be very difficult to vote, and your vote can have more or less meaning depending on how easy it is to access the voting polls. So as we see here, that housing is such a basic and important need, and that it is the basis for all other rights and privileges and benefits in society. The Fair Housing Act was enacted almost 50 years ago, and it passed in Congress days after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It had been sitting in Congress over many years, and it had been highly debated and very controversial. It just so happened that after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a very similar social uprising as we're seeing right now in our country, across the country. And at the same time, there was a growing number of African American and Hispanic members of the armed forces who had fought and died in the Vietnam War. And many of them had returned home to their families only to find that they could not purchase homes, or that they could not live in the neighborhoods that they wanted to because of discrimination around race and national origin. So all of these factors combined helped pass the Federal Fair Housing Act. And at the time that it passed, it was just applicable to race, color, religion, and national origin. In 1974, sex was added, and in 1988, protections for people with disabilities and familial status was added to the Fair Housing Act. And today it's enforced by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, some provisions by the Department of Justice, and locally by the Vermont Human Rights Commission, the entity that Amanda and I work for. To prove a housing discrimination case, you have to show that the plaintiff or complainant is a member in a protected class, that we're dealing with a dwelling, that there was some kind of negative or adverse action, and that that action occurred because of someone's membership in a protected class. There are also other prohibited activities that are identified in the laws that is also a violation of the fair housing laws. And in some of those, and we'll talk about them in a second, that you don't necessarily need to show it occurred because of someone's protected status. So what are the protected classes? Well, the list on the left of your screen are the protected classes that are covered under both federal and the state of Vermont. So race, all races, color, national origin, disability, familial status, religion, and sex. And the state of Vermont goes a little further and protects more people. It protects people falling under protected classes identified as sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, age, receipt of public assistance in Section 8, amount of income based on zoning laws, and victims and survivors of domestic violence, domestic and sexual violence, which was added most recently. Let's just talk a little bit about race and color. Anyone know what the difference is between race and color? You want to take a stab at that? Why would we need two separate classes, race and color?
Well, I'm struggling to get here. I mean, race is a construct, and it depends on who's deciding races and what race we're talking about. So what is that about? Color is obvious. Color is a fact. My skin is white, someone else's is black, someone's brown. So I don't quite understand the race.
Okay.
By whose definition? White people are banned? White people have a problem? What is that about?
Thank you, Anne, for sharing that. Did we have any other comments in the chat section?
No.
Okay. So yes, race is a social construct, but it is also a construct that has been used for legal purposes that in many ways have made decisions based on that social construct. And so when we think of race as a protected class, we do think of those social constructs like African American, Caucasian, Asian American, etc. Color is the color of one's skin. And
Can I ask a question? Could I ask a question?
Hold on one second.
Okay.
Yeah, I will ask everyone to mute themselves, and then ask your question in the chat, and then Amanda will interrupt me. And if you're having trouble doing that, you can also raise your hand and Amanda will see you too. But so color, we all have different color skin, and so two white people may not both have the same color skin, just like two African American persons may not have the same color skin. We come in different shades. And sometimes you'll have a landlord or manager or housing provider of some sort, not discriminate against people of that entire race, but people who are darker skin of the same race. So let's say you have a landlord who says, I like light-skinned African American, I'll rent to them, but not dark-skinned African American. That's an example of discrimination on the basis of color. Likewise, you might have a Caucasian person who has darker skin, and while they belong in the Caucasian race, they might be discriminated against because their skin is darker and the landlord perceived them to be a racial minority. So you might have discrimination on the basis of that as well. What's also interesting here too is that in a lot of these, there is also protection for actual status and perceived status. So disability is an example of that. You may have a disability, or you may be perceived to be a person with a disability. Both those are protected under the fair housing laws. Age is another good example of something that is a little bit different as well. Age discrimination, when we think of age discrimination, we usually think of discrimination against those who are older, those who are more senior. And that's because in our employment discrimination laws, age discrimination only protects you after age 40. Here, under our fair housing laws, age is any age. And usually the group of individuals that typically raise age discrimination complaints are actually people who are 18, 19, early 20s, because rental managers and landlords and other housing providers don't necessarily want to rent to them because of a perception that they lack maturity, or that they will party, or that they will create damage to property or be irresponsible, etc. It's sort of those assumptions that the age protected category really seeks to protect, but it's any age. To find a housing violation, you must also show that there is a dwelling involved. The definition of dwelling is any building occupied or intended to be occupied as a residence. Apartments, condos, homes, mobile home parks, cooperatives. Sometimes there are some exceptions for mobile home parks and some exceptions for shelters and motels. And that's because people don't necessarily live in a hotel or a motel with the intent of it becoming a residence. So usually these are places that are short-term living facilities, and they are covered under our public accommodations statutes, not under our fair housing laws. However, it's possible that they can become residential facilities or residential homes or permanent residences. And that is because we use them that way, and there is an expectation and an intent to use it that way. I'll just give you an example. We have a lot of tourists in Vermont during leaf season and during the winter season because of skiing. But a lot of these hotels and motels sit vacant, sometimes during the summer. And so owners will then make them available to staff or to other people to rent for longer periods of time, like several months. That's an example of where something that was actually just a place of public accommodation became a dwelling under the fair housing laws. And that's important to know because we need to know whether the law is applicable, and it changes various requirements and obligations and rights, whether it's a place of public accommodation versus a housing under the Fair Housing Act. What things are prohibited by the law? A refusal to rent, sell, negotiate, or otherwise make unavailable. Applying different terms and conditions to different groups of people. Making statements such as verbal or written statements against a protected class. We'll talk about exemptions in a few minutes, but this is an area where there are no exemptions. No one can make a discriminatory statement, either verbally or written, like in an advertisement against protected class members. Representing that a unit is not available when it actually is. And harassment, coercing, intimidating, and threatening and interfering with someone's right to enjoy housing. Denying a reasonable accommodation or modification request. Making zoning regulations that are taking into account income and protected class memberships that have a disparate impact on members of the protected class. When towns get together and talk about whether or not they should allow affordable homes to be built, that's sometimes where you might hear discriminatory statements or people saying, we don't want that, we don't want them here. Those kinds of actions, if they're motivated by discrimination, are prohibited under the fair housing laws. So who can file a complaint? Tenants, prospective tenants or buyers, fair housing organizations, and anyone who is affected by the fair housing, by the adverse action. It could be a guest of a tenant. So let's say you have a tenant who is able-bodied, but they have a guest who is in a wheelchair and they experience discrimination while they're visiting. That person has a complaint against that landlord or manager, even though they don't have a rental agreement with the landlord or manager, because they are being affected by the adverse housing action. Exemptions are the specific exceptions to the laws, to the rules. Religious organizations can discriminate on the basis of religious beliefs when they're providing housing, but not on race or national origin. Mrs. Murphy is also a well-known exemption to the Fair Housing Act. As I mentioned to you earlier, the Fair Housing Act was passed during a really pivotal time in our country when people were still very openly racist. And Mrs. Murphy is a hypothetical character that was created by a Republican senator who said, what about the little old white woman who is a widow and she needs to convert her house into a home where she can rent it out to other people to supplement her limited income. So Mrs. Murphy is the fictitious, racist, older white lady who doesn't want to live with Black people. And in an attempt to pass the Fair Housing Act, we created a exemption for the Mrs. Murphy in the world, where we say, yes, you have the right to discriminate in your own home if you want to, if you're renting parts of your home. Single family homes, where someone is renting out a single family home, is exempted from the Federal Fair Housing Act, but not Vermont. So that means that even if you don't own multiple homes and you're just renting out one home, you still fall under the Vermont Fair Housing laws. What does discrimination look like? Well, discrimination can be very explicit. In the old days, we don't see this as often anymore, but in the old days, it was whites only, or we want white tenants in our white community. Today, we still see a lot of explicit discrimination, but it looks more like this. This is a home that is ideal for a couple. No Section 8 here. We're seeking professionals. Ages 25 to 65 only, please. This is a perfect apartment for empty nesters. English speaking only. You must be employed. These are all explicitly discriminatory statements. They discriminate against specific groups of people. Obviously, ideal for a couple is saying no minor children. No Section 8 is just against the law. English speaking only is against national origin discrimination. Perfect for empty nesters, again, minor children, and also age, and so forth. must be employed. Well, you can't discriminate on the basis of someone's source of income. Someone might receive public assistance or Section 8, and they have the right to live in that place as well. Discrimination can also be very subtle, and it doesn't show up in those forms that we just kind of reviewed and talked about. In its 2014 rental discrimination report, Vermont Legal Aid reported the results of their testings that they had been doing. And what they found out is that housing providers in Vermont generally disfavor African Americans, renters of foreign origin, renters with children, and renters with disabilities. In fact, they found that to be true in about 44% of the tests. And for national origin discrimination, they found it to be true in about 48% of the tests. That means that in almost 50% of cases, there was housing discrimination discovered. So for those of you who don't know, testing is when you send actors out to inquire about actual available rental units to see if there's a difference in treatment between people of different protected classes and categories. And typically what they do, and there's a whole science behind it, but if you're testing whether there's discrimination on the basis of race, you send out a control tester who is white and a subject tester who is African American to see if there's a difference in treatment. Interestingly, what they found was that housing providers were very nice, very polite, very courteous, kind, smiled, shook their hands, and that a lot of the subject testers had no idea that they were being discriminated against until they were able to see the difference in how they were treated compared to their white testers. What they found was that oftentimes housing providers, when a home was no longer available, housing providers would share information about other available units with white testers, but not African American testers or testers who were from a foreign origin. Also, they would not follow up with subject testers. So you might have a subject tester that says, hey, I was just calling back to follow up and see what happened. A lot of the times the housing providers would say, oh, it's no longer available, or just wouldn't even answer those calls or return those calls. But in fact, the unit was still available and they were being made available to the white control tester. Furthermore, what they found was African American subject testers were being asked more questions about their household composition. Do they have kids? Who's going to be living with them, etc. And asked a lot more questions about their employment compared to the white control testers who didn't receive those questions, were very limited. So what could housing discrimination look like if it's not explicit? Sometimes it's, this is not the safest neighborhood versus this house gets great light. We are seeing housing providers emphasize negative attributes of a home or a neighborhood and emphasizing the positive attributes if it is the prospective tenant that they like. I've heard a few bad things about the school, but I'm sure it's just gossip versus the school has great teachers and small class sizes. Oh, someone saw the house this morning. I am pretty sure they're going to sign the lease. I'll call you if anything changes. The suggestion that the unit is already unavailable when it might still be available. You are perfect for this place, smile, handshake, but before I give it to you, I need your W-2s, your tax returns, your contact information for your current employer. They may not necessarily be asking for all of this information from a different individual that they like. Just curious, what do you do for a living? I should warn you that your neighbors are a little noisy. I'm happy to come to your place to review the lease. Sort of a desire to come and see where you live and what it looks like. I'm only willing to rent this place for 3 months. I thought I put that in the advertisement, right? Something as important as how long a home is available for all of a sudden it seems like it's only available for a short time to sort of discourage people from the rental unit. We know that housing discrimination occurs even after someone is able to access that opportunity to rent and to buy, because there are different terms and conditions that are set. Accepting rent late from other tenants, but not you. Giving you warnings for being noisy, but not other tenants. For example, saying you need to tell your children to be quiet or I might evict you, but allowing other tenants to have gatherings or parties that are also equally noisy. Limiting the number of guests you can have, but not others. Telling you to speak English in the common areas. Asking you to pay a larger security deposit than others because of a disability that you have, or because they don't trust that you'll be able to maintain the home. Letting tenants hang a Christmas wreath, but telling someone that they can't hang a religious artifact on their door. Needing to inspect the unit more than others. Housing discrimination also covers harassment, as we talked about. So housing can become unavailable if people are subjected to harassment after the fact. Name calling, racial slurs, discriminatory statements, things like go back to your country, you don't belong here, your food is disgusting, you have to speak English. The law prohibits neighbor-on-neighbor harassment. Even when people buy their homes, the Fair Housing Act also prohibits harassment from those neighbors. So this isn't just a landlord and rental manager issue. But in those apartment units and those condo units, housing providers have a duty to address harassment. It's not, a landlord can't go, I'm not discriminating against you on the basis of national origin, I rent it to you, but it's not my fault that those other tenants are racist or discriminating. Housing providers, landlords, managers, they have a duty to address that harassment, and they can be held liable for failing to do that. So both other tenants and other neighbors, as well as the housing providers, can be held legally liable under the Fair Housing Act for failing to address harassment. How prevalent is housing discrimination? Well, we talked a little bit already about what the Vermont Legal Aid's testing results showed, and it showed us at least 50% of the time, or it's close to 50% of the time. But I would say that at least anecdotally, we know that housing discrimination happens very, very often. But we cannot capture all of that data and all of that information. There's a lot of reasons why tenants don't come forward. And there are many factors in the state of Vermont that make it really difficult to capture that data and to capture that information and how prevalent housing discrimination is. I am curious to know what you all think are those factors. Can you think of why it would be hard to detect housing discrimination in Vermont? So you can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you.
We have many people are not aware about housing discrimination and who to report it to. Also, there's low vacancy rates, more competitive markets for apartments.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
Actually, I want to ask what the question was way back when I couldn't unmute myself. What was the question there?
The question is, why is it hard to detect housing discrimination in Vermont? What are some of the factors? Yeah.
Oh, I got
we
it.
heard some really good responses to that.
We also have subtle forms of discrimination, fear of complaining, intimidation by property owner and or tenant or neighbor. Some people don't want to waste time to report.
Yeah, Yes, perfect.
Yeah, I've got them.
All of these are great answers. You're absolutely right. Housing is scarce in Vermont, and people are desperate to maintain their homes or to get that housing. And so even if they're being asked for multiple forms of references and background check, and they note in their heart that this feels unfair, or they might even know from talking to other tenants that they're being treated differently, they're going to move forward with it because they need that housing. Likewise, because housing is scarce, you might have a landlord who actually is very, let's say, explicitly racist, but let's say he's racist against African Americans. He may have 9 equally qualified tenants who are willing to receive that or to move forward and rent that unit. And so you never hear him voice those discriminatory statements out loud. You never see that. In addition to that, you're right, there are many competing demands on housing in Vermont, and testing is also really hard. In order for testing to occur, it has to occur very quickly. Housing is on the market and off the market sometimes within 24 hours. It's impossible to get actors in there looking at units and apartments in a fair amount of time. And if you're doing that kind of test, you need reliability. So you need a script, you need consistency in the way that people act and what they say. And so you need to get your actors ready to do that. That takes like at least a couple of days. The housing is already unavailable. So we can't even test in many instances because the housing is so scarce around here. And another important factor is that in Vermont, people rent through word of mouth and people sell through word of mouth a lot more than they might elsewhere. People don't want to bother with putting ads out, and they want to just rent to people that they know and they believe that those are the individuals that they trust. But we also know that many homes in the state of Vermont are owned by white people, and that a lot of those investors are also white, and that because of affinity bias, people tend to spend time and are friends with those that are like them. And so if you're only renting through word of mouth or through informal processes, that kind of informal process in fact favors other white prospective tenants. And it excludes groups of people in our community that we may not even intend to exclude, but we are in fact doing that. We know for a fact that informal hiring practices favor white people and exclude racial and ethnic minorities. So being mindful of that is important. Well, why didn't the Fair Housing Act eliminate housing discrimination? That's a very good question. In order to know, we have to think about the relationship between systemic discrimination, individual, and implicit bias. Here, I'm going to give just one example around racism towards African Americans. Systemic racism, individual racism, and implicit bias against African Americans. And that example starts with segregation in housing. There was already a time many years ago when white people and black people had already started to live in integrated housing. They were already living in the same communities and the same apartments. But then you had the government coming in with public housing programs that demolished integrated housing and said, you have to live apart. White people and black people cannot live together. You had the federal government subsidizing suburban housing development on the condition that those homes can only be sold to white people and that the deeds had to prohibit the resale to black people for generations. And then you had zoning laws at the town level and at the city level where black parts of towns were zoned for industrial plants, waste, and toxic use, but the same was not true of white neighborhoods. So white neighborhoods got to thrive and be beautiful, and people got to own them. And black parts of towns stayed public housing, apartments, and there was waste and toxic use in those areas. Well, black neighborhoods that became known as slums, white people developed a belief that black people did not care for their homes and their communities. And we see that that has an impact even today. We know that real estate agents and rental housing providers show fewer available homes and apartments to Black people today. Well, what is the result of that? Is that there's an impact that we still see today because of those actions, and that the Fair Housing Law, which was enacted over 50 years ago, did never address past discrimination. It was future thinking. It was about, all right, from here on out, we won't allow you to discriminate against people anymore. Which, by the way, that did nothing for those deeds. Homes with restrictive covenants continued to be sold to white families for generations thereafter. Those homes increased substantially in value and equity. Black income is approximately only 60% of white income, and Black wealth is only 5 to 7% of white wealth. The result of that is Black children are more likely to attend under-resourced schools. Black voters are 4 times as likely as white voters to report difficulties voting. Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely as white women to die in childbirth, in part because of a lack of access to quality health care. So earlier in this presentation, we talked about the connection between housing and voting and schools and healthcare. And so we see how housing segregation in our history still has an impact on the disparities that we see today. And we see why the testing results are the way they are. People still hold on to those beliefs about groups of people in our community, which are inaccurate. I want to, before I take your questions, I want to share the video that we created for you, and we'd love to, one, take your questions and also hear your take on our video and your feedback. I want to make sure my share audio.
And the mission of the Vermont Human Rights Commission is to promote full civil and human rights in Vermont. The Commission protects people from unlawful discrimination in housing, state government employment, and in places of public accommodation. Places of public accommodation include grocery stores, schools, hospitals, prisons, and even roads. Today, we want to share with you how to file a housing discrimination complaint with us and why you should. What is housing discrimination? Housing discrimination is the illegal practice of discriminating against buyers or renters because they belong to a protected class. It's also harassment from neighbors, landlords, or rental managers, even after you've moved into your home. It can also cover discriminatory decisions made by your local government in how they decide where to build and what services are available and where. And it also requires landlords and managers to give you certain accommodations due to your disability. What are protected classes? The Fair Housing Protection has been around since the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and these rights exist to correct the history of unfavorable treatment of people of certain groups. A protected class is a group of people protected from housing discrimination by law. There are 7 protected classes that come from federal regulations and another 6 in Vermont. The protected classes in fair housing are color of your skin, race, sex, religion, national origin, disability, familial status, that means the presence of minor children, sexual orientation, gender identification, marital status, age, receipt of public assistance, and if you are a victim of domestic and sexual violence. You are still protected if you are undocumented. Fair housing laws also apply to zoning and planning practices. Remember, you can be part of one or more categories at the same time. Our identities are complex and beautiful. What does discrimination look like? are treated differently because of your race, sex, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any of the protected classes. The rental manager asks you for a background check, but will not ask someone white. The landlord will not take your Section 8 voucher. The rental manager says you need to do him some favors if you want to keep living here. The landlord will not show you all the available apartments because you have children or a disability. The rental manager will take a late rent check from other tenants, but not you. The landlord allows your neighbors to make fun of your language, your food, or otherwise make you feel uncomfortable and unsafe in your home. If you're not sure, call us. We'll help you. How to file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. To file a complaint, all you have to do is go to our website, hrc.vermont.gov, and fill out a questionnaire. We can work with you if you need interpretation. Just send us an email with a request at human.rights@vermont.gov. If you're asking yourself why you should be filing a discrimination complaint, here are some answers. If you're going to continue to live in the house or apartment, you have the right to exist in a discrimination-free environment. Discrimination can stop happening to others because you file a complaint. The respondent will have to receive training, develop policies, collect data, or anything else required to ensure that the issue is dealt with. It informs our governor, our lawmakers, our community members that discrimination is still prevalent and problematic in Vermont, and it requires action. Remember, landlords cannot retaliate against a tenant for exercising a legal right. That is also against the law. The best tool we can have is to know our rights. Remember, fair housing is the law, and discrimination and harassment is illegal. When you decide to take the first step, we are ready for you.
Thank you. I would welcome any questions or discussions or just feedback about our video and presentation. So feel free to unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Anne.
I know it comes.
You're good.
I'm
You're
off. Oh, okay. It just didn't move. Well, I want to just say that the telephone number needs to appear toward the end on every single slide, because most likely that's the best way anyone's going to communicate, I would guess, is by phone, not by email or, website or anything. It came up twice. I had trouble. I know what it is now, but I had trouble memorizing it.
Sure, thank you.
The video is going to be translated into 10 languages. And so we're going to have all the languages on our site with the same video.
I wanted to share also that we have a more lengthy fair housing training that we put on once a month, and it's free. And we just ask for a donation, but people don't have to feel obligated to donate if they want to come to that. And so all you have to do is contact our office and then sign up for that. But we put that on every month, once a month, and it goes into a lot more details than this presentation was able to address today. There's a lot more nuances to fair housing laws, like religious accommodations and reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities, and the difference between service animals and assistance animals, and more. So, and what sort of verifications can a landlord ask for? Yeah, so there is a lot more, and we'd love to invite you to attend one of those fair housing trainings with us.
I would say the idea for these materials for people who are working with the communities is that, you know, you don't have to know all the answers, but know that, you know, there are some specific housing discrimination that happens that people might not be aware. And I know as an organizer, you know, those are things that come up as like gentle conversations with people when they're sharing about their life. And that's when you can pinpoint, it's like, oh, you should, you know, really check in with the Human Rights Commission. We do have interpreters that we can connect to if people feel comfortable in a different language. And so, yes, so that's kind of like we put it up because we know that people don't access things like this. Any other questions or feedback for the video?
We know that many of you probably represent entities, and if you think that there might be opportunities to work together, to collaborate, to meet, or to meet the people that you serve, we'd be happy to do that and to think about that and brainstorm ways that we can work together. So we want to invite you to really invite us to engage in those conversations as well.
I wanted to say something. Could I say something?
Of course.
Oh, okay. I think outside of even Vermont, I'm in the state of Florida, Tampa Bay. There needs to be more lawful source of income, which includes those rental assistance vouchers throughout our nation, because primarily it is a classism issue with using the voucher, and then the secondary in many jurisdictions, it's a racism issue. For example, a place like Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, or even Washington, D.C., which D.C. does have a law in place, but over 90% of the Section 8 voucher holders in those jurisdictions are Black. So when a landlord says no to the Section 8 or no to the temporary rental assistance voucher, they're saying no, Blacks allowed, essentially. So those laws really need to be on the books. I know the state of Maryland law goes into effect in October, and the city of Atlanta law just went into effect this month, and California and Virginia laws went into effect sometime this year too. So more of those laws really need to be protected to protect low-income renters, and also homeless vets that receive vouchers and what have you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you're absolutely right about that, that a lot of these are, when they say no Section 8, they are discriminating against who they think, certain groups of people too. So yeah, it's pretext for something else. In the state of Vermont, we do have, it is prohibited to discriminate against anyone on the basis like receiving public assistance. And so any kind of ad that says no Section 8 is prohibited.
How much reach out can you even do to landlords and people who rent things? I mean, I don't, so I'm not, it wouldn't have come across my bow, but I mean, I'm not in this for that. I'm in it because I'm a member of an organization that's concerned about this. But so I just wondered how much we were able to tell landlords.
That's a really great question. You're right, it can be very hard and difficult.
Yeah.
I would say that we probably can reach out to landlords even more easily than renters, because landlords, there's at least some organization going on with landlords. There's some associations they belong at, not everyone though. And in the state of Vermont, there are a lot of single landlords who are not in the business of doing it. They just decided that they were moving and they'd rent, or they'd rent part of their unit. And so, yes, we do have a ton of landlords in the state of Vermont who don't know the law and who need to. I would say that our fair housing trainings that we do are attended typically by landlords who care about it. And also when we settle complaint discrimination, we enforce trainings. We ask everyone to do a training if they settle a claim at the Human Rights Commission. But it is incredibly difficult to reach out to tenants, who is typically a group of folks that are not hard organized. And that is really hard to tell them what the rights are. And so the best thing we can do is continue to do trainings like this, put out videos in different languages, share it with as many people as we can, who can then distribute that. There are many different organizations in the state of Vermont that we are associated with. And we try to connect with them so that they can distribute and disseminate information. But yeah, it's hard.
All right, we'll do it. Disseminate information.
Thank you, yes. We'll send you a link to those videos when they've been translated so that you can share that.
That's great. I would prefer something a little shorter. I don't know how long people's attention span is for little characters wandering around on a page.
Yeah.
I think the whole thing might get condensed a bit, but I'm not a filmmaker either, so I can't talk about that. Just disseminate information.
Thank you. That's information that's appreciated. Absolutely. Thank you for saying
Yeah.
that.
And it's, fair housing is a lot. It's so much information that, the 5 minutes was like